but you killed your daughter for the love of a bum named Brad, an unemployed, drug-taking, manipulative loser. Your beautiful daughter, Gabby, was a sacrifice you gave that bum Brad to fulfill his sick and demonic sense of love and control. You and that monster systematically destroyed this beautiful child's spirit, body, but never her soul. You allowed him to put your child in a garbage bag when she wet herself, to give her drugs. Your response was, Brad beat her ass. Her story was told and should be a warning to all the baby breeders that are out here silently torturing their children, that in Wayne County, torture and child killings will be prosecuted to the fullest degree. It is fitting, as we embark on this holiday season, that you and Brad are where you both belong, behind bars like the animals that you are.
I think we can all agree that every single judge in the world needs to be trained by specifically this judge. Hi guys, welcome back to the channel. Thanks for joining me today. Wow, the torture and murder of Gabrielle Barrett is one of those cases that is absolutely devastating, literally devastating on every single level. I talk about trauma a lot on this channel and the impact that trauma can have when people are growing through their childhood into the human being adults that they're going to become. But the reality is, I can never find it in my heart to have sympathy and empathy for those who themselves are traumatized, who then go on to traumatize, because it tends to work in exactly the opposite direction. Lots of you come to this channel, you've shared your personal experiences of horrendous abuse with me, and the reality is you have become incredibly compassionate, loving, empathetic human beings who would never harm anybody. I do not allow trauma to play into the horrendous deeds in the future. I just don't. Because it's something that can be resolved. It's something that should heighten your understanding of pain that can be caused to others because of your own experiences. But then I guess what we can also say is, just as the vast majority of people who are traumatized in their childhood never ever go on to do anything negative. In fact, very often they become more vulnerable because they don't want to harm anybody and they want to please people. But there will be this tiny subset who will have the predisposition to grow into human predators who also incur and experience trauma. And it's as if they internalize it and allow that internalization to fester and then give themselves a permission-based and justification for the most heinous of acts. And honestly, today is going to example all that I've just said in technicolor. For those of you new to my channel, I release my content here twice weekly. If you do like deep dive crime content, why don't you subscribe, get your notifications on? And if you are enjoying my content, please give me a like, it makes a difference to me. As ever, you can get lots more of my content on Patreon and on YouTube members. Thank you to every single one of you who is supporting me over there. Let's crack on with today's true crime case. Like I said, it's always difficult when we cover children dying because we know it goes against the absolute grain of how our society should work. Our society should protect children more than any others because they are literally brought into this world vulnerable and they require our guidance, our mentorship and our compassion. But of course, this case is going to highlight the absolute opposite. So on New Year's Day 2018, basically what happens is emergency services are called to a mobile home in Sumter Township in Michigan. It is a really haunting scene for those first responders, and the reason for that is this gorgeous little girl, Gabrielle Barrett, is literally lifeless in the bathtub. And this isn't a drowning incident, this isn't an accident. Her body has been ravaged by burns, by bruises, and they are protracted and sustained over a period of time. We're talking about months of torment. And of course, the reason that she's in the bathtub is because the people who have stolen her life are not strangers. This isn't a situation where some random individual has come and murdered a child. We're talking about the very people who should have protected her more than anything in the world. In particular, Candice Diaz, her mother, and also her mother's boyfriend, Brad Fields. Because even though he wasn't the biological father, if you're brought in to a child's life, you are given the ultimate gift of being allowed to be part and privy to that child's upbringing, then you should do everything in your power to ensure that that child is protected on every single level. Let's talk about Candice, the mother. Let's have a look at her history and the activating factors that one could argue could essentially lead to this kind of sad situation playing out. Like I said, we're not excusing any of this, quite the contrary, but just to give us a background as to who she is and who she's been in her life. So she was born in 1993 in Michigan, still a very relatively young woman today. Her early years were awful. Don't know how else to say it. There's no point framing it in psychological terms because it's just awful. So it involved neglect, abuse, a lot of instability. Her father was basically a deadbeat father. He was absent most of the time. And if he ever did come back into her life on the occasions that he did, he was really emotionally and physically abusive. Her mother, she has dependency issues. Now the issues there mean that she's not going to be present for her daughter, and also her daughter's not going to get the level of support and protection that she requires because the mum's going to be thinking about her next fix. And unfortunately, that's the way it works. Now, reports from social workers and family members, they all contributed to forming this picture of her childhood that was deplorable. So she suffered from physical abuse, emotional degradation. And if you think about that, we're talking about a child who's humiliated, who's made to feel like nothing, worthless. Just imagine how the brain responds and reacts to that. So we do studies of brains in children who are neglected versus who are physically abused versus who are typical, as in they're brought up in an environment where they're given the right opportunities and benefits to thrive. And of course, when it comes down to the brain development, the thriving child has a brain that looks completely typical. But then the one who's physically abused will not be too far behind. And the reason for that is because physical abuse means there is some kind of contact and notice, i.e. you don't want to be noticed necessarily by your physical abuser, but that's better than being ignored. It's better than being humiliated. It's better than being neglected as far as the brain is concerned, because you are being acknowledged in a way, albeit physically. When we're talking about the neglect that she suffered, she was just ignored. And when she was spoken to, she was humiliated. Also, constant exposure to domestic violence. She would often witness beatings, and she wasn't well fed. She was left without adequate food. Very often she was found unwashed, and she was in clothes that she'd worn for days and days and days, and her hair would often be matted. And I think that when you consider children, we all know that every parent has a different set and subset of rules. So, for example, I don't bath my baby girl, who is 2 years old nearly, every day. It's every 3 days or so because she's little, she doesn't go out and get herself filthy, and she's always clean and presented. But, you know, there's not a huge amount of ceremony over a daily shower, for example. I do what my parents did with me when I was growing up. Equally, I can remember at school children who smelled, but their hair was still clean. So it was as if there was some attempt to keep them in line with what we would consider is clean and tidy, but there were some failures there as well, particularly, for example, if they were wet in the bed and weren't having a bath or a shower every single day. But when you get to a point where a child's hair is matted, you're talking about a prolonged time frame where they haven't had a brush go through it, and that shows severe neglect. Now, by the age of 5, Candice had actually been removed by Child Protection Services on multiple occasions, and it's a shame that she was ever returned because the home was completely inadequate and the carers were not present in a way that was absolutely essential for a child to feel safety. So at this point, she's put under the care of her grandmother. This is at 4 years old, and her grandmother's careless and useless. I'm not going to dress it up. They're the only words that I can come up with: careless and useless. I would actually add relatively sadistic as well, just in the attitude that she clearly has towards a child. There is a particular event that plays out that I think really brings this home. So her grandmother is having a cigarette, falls asleep, accidentally sets fire to the house. Once she wakes up, she gets herself out of the window and she leaves Candice still inside. And she can hear Candice screaming, but she never attempts to go back in to save her. She just left her there. And she left her there to burn. Candice did actually survive by the grace of God, but she was literally left with severe burns covering at least half of her body. She had to have multiple surgeries, skin grafts. And if you actually consider for a moment how distinct the reaction of the grandmother is here compared to what you or I would do, if it was a stranger's child, I would run into those flames, let alone if it was somebody who was blood related to me and that was in my ward of care. But she just allows that child to scream as she burns, and she does nothing. What kind of a message does that send to a developing Candice? You're worthless, you can burn, and I'll just stand by and listen to you scream. Now, to some degree, I want you to hold in your mind the fact that this happened to Candice when she was a child, because it does foreshadow the crimes that are committed in the long term by her. Now, understandably, when you're a child and you've been exposed to such a failure of care, neglect, and also to a horrendous event like being burnt, PTSD is something that's very common. And that is one of the psychological conditions that she actually develops and is diagnosed with. She understandably has recurring nightmares about fire. She's very untrusting of anyone in her family because they failed her massively. Can you imagine knowing that you had been left to burn to death? Going through the agonizing pain of dealing with the burns, the nerve damage, all of the skin grafts that are agonizing, losing your childhood to that experience and knowing that the people who are meant to protect you are the reason that you ended up that way. No wonder she doesn't trust anybody. Now, this event leads to Candice's mother, Marina, and a grandmother to be arrested and charged with second-degree criminal abuse because they were seen as responsible for allowing the fire to happen. And amen to that, that should happen. So a 12-month sentence is given to both the grandmother and the mother. Bear in mind, her deadbeat dad is also being held in prison at the time. It's for unrelated offences, but he's locked away. So at this point, with all those banged up, she's basically under the care of another relative at that time. And just think about it for a minute as well. The grandmother, the mother and the father, they're all banged away. They've got quite a lot of time on their hands, let's just say that, because they're in prison. None of them ever attempted to contact her whilst they were locked up. Could you be any more callous? Could you be any more egocentric? Could you be any more self-focused than that? This child has almost died because of your neglect, and you don't even have the good grace to pick up a pen and keep in contact with them. They are appalling excuses for human beings. But also you have to consider the fact that we're talking about genetics and codes of genetics. And with respect, even though Candice is a child right now, and we can completely empathise and sympathise with her at this moment in time, it doesn't mean that there is not a subset genetically within her that could be as problematic as those experienced by her paternal and maternal family members, who are all callous to the core, it seems. Now, she ends up having a fortunate turn of events, really. At the age of 7, a woman called Cynthia Diaz, who's her paternal grandmother, actually adopts her. Now, she has had quite an ordered life. She was a retired corrections officer. She was also a military veteran. She had a stable income. She had stable housing. She had no criminal records at the time. So she was obviously seen by the CPS as a suitable guardian and genuinely someone who could offer Candice the security and structure she'd never known. And how to describe Cynthia Diaz? Well, obviously her background tells a story. She was somebody who really enjoyed living by the rigour of rules. For example, she believed in strict discipline. Her military background had served her well, but that strict discipline was out of the intention of love, not force. We're not conflating love with power and control here. We're saying that yes, there are rules and rigour in her household, but it came from a place of compassion. She had this real philosophy that structure equaled success. And I think that a lot of us can relate to that really effectively. We all know how much better we fare when we feel organised. And so this woman allows this child who's had all of this brokenness in her background, all of these problems in her background, into her home and into her heart. And she does a really good job. Now, in 2012, Candice is 19 at this point. She ends up moving to Detroit with Cynthia. And after the move, at 19, you can imagine, you are interested in relationships. And she meets a guy called Kyle Bennett. He's 2 years older than her. And not long after that initial meeting, Candice becomes pregnant. On the 3rd of July 2013, Gabrielle is born. She's often referred to as Gabby. And she was actually raised in the home with Candice, Kyle and Cynthia. So again, representative of Cynthia being a very open human being in spite of her rules and rigour, because clearly she would rather her daughter, because she's adopted her, or at least fostered her in a position where she plays that role as daughter and exists within that role as daughter. She is somebody that I'm sure would have preferred for Candice to have got married before having a baby, but she obviously has welcomed Kyle into the home and now the little girl as well. Now, Cynthia later tells investigators that Gabby had been a really happy, really affectionate, really bright child. I mean, she's absolutely beautiful, those big eyes, and just something so innocent and so typical in the most positive ways when it comes down to being a little girl. Just the way that she examples everything that's so lovely about little girls. She was apparently somebody who was really artistic. She loved to colour, she was curious. And this is a description that I think is beautiful that Cynthia said. She said she had the innocent gentleness that only 4-year-olds can truly possess. And I think that that is just such a profound statement, because that's absolutely it. 4-year-olds, they're starting to explore the world, but they're still entirely vulnerable, independent, and they haven't been affected to the degree that we will be at 10, for example, or 15. There's still the innocence and wide-eyed wonder that plays out for children of that age. Now, after 6 months of Gabby being born, unfortunately, Kyle and Candice split up, and this means that the little girl is left in the hands of Candice and Cynthia. But it doesn't take very long for Candice to meet a guy called Brad Fields. This is through mutual acquaintances. He's 24, whilst Candice is 20. And I tell you what, I'm sorry guys, this is going to sound highly judgmental. And I know that you can never just read a book by its cover, but this guy is just this massive flappy appendage on every single level. I don't know whether that's going to offend some of you, and I apologise if it does, but there's just something about him when I look at him that's grotesque. That's the only way I can describe it. And I'm not talking about his size, by the way. He is a very big guy. It's just his facial features, the way that he expresses himself when I've seen him in court, everything about him just repulses me. And of course, I know the background, and that's going to add to the weight and emphasis of my judgment. But that's what I'm going to refer to him as, a flappy appendage, and one that sadly remains in this little girl's life until she no longer has a life. Let's talk about this excuse for a human being. Bradley Allen Fields. He was born in Michigan in 1989. There isn't a lot known about his biological family or early childhood. I guess that they would want to distance themselves from this human being, because I certainly would. If I'd had even any kind of presence in his life, I would not want to be associated with him for even a millisecond. Now, court records, police files, psychiatric reports, they do evidence that Brad was raised in a relatively violent, emotionally barren environment, and the belief is that he did suffer neglect. Also, he was exposed quite early on to criminal behaviour. None of those are excuses for what we're going to talk about today at all. And you know why I'm going to really head that home to you guys? In prison, child killers are the lowest of the low. And they're literally surrounded by people who are violent, who have been criminalised their entire lives, who've had awful backgrounds themselves, and they rate them as the lowest of the low, because criminals still have a moral compass about acceptable crime in their mindset and spectrum versus unacceptable crime. So for me, that's all I need to know. The vast majority of violent criminals mark child killers as disgraceful and treat them as such. So exposure to criminal behaviour and all the things I've just highlighted that so many people in prison go through do not result in you doing horrendous things to kids. Now, by his early teens, he'd already been labelled as a high-risk juvenile. That was something that was absolutely acceptable and appropriate, and maybe should have told a story where he shouldn't have been allowed around children full stop in the future. But obviously, as we know, these things never seem to translate to reality. He apparently abused animals, so psychopath right there. Engaged in property destruction because he's got no impulse control and also doesn't have any boundaries. And he began using drugs before the age of 15. Not ideal when it comes down to mental health. Now, by the age of 17, he'd already been in and out of detention centres for burglary, battery and resisting arrest. Now, he would also later be diagnosed with schizoaffective disorder. She can go through periods of psychotic break, can go through periods of serious depression and mania, etc. But for the vast majority of people who have a diagnosis of schizoaffective disorder, they are not going to harm another human being. In fact, they're more at risk of harming themselves than anybody in the wider population. But like I said, you can be a psychopathic predator and also develop schizoaffective disorder. It's the fact that you're a psychopathic lunatic that actually means that you're a danger to our society, not because you have a mental health condition. He also was diagnosed with PTSD because of his early trauma, and apparently had really explosive anger issues, antisocial tendencies. He had been convicted of felony assault, domestic violence, and whenever he was on probation, he would have multiple probation violations. He did serve time in state prison, and he frequently violated parole upon release. One former girlfriend that he had been with filed a restraining order claiming that Brad had threatened to kill her, and one of the things that he would regularly do was stalk her workplace. So Brad seems like a really great guy. I mean, if you're going to think about having a relationship with somebody, think about a guy like Brad. He has all the hallmarks of a perfect partner. And I do understand that often fate intervenes and you meet people with backgrounds that are not perfect, that you try to overcome because you were attracted to them, for example. But I think that we should all have some boundaries where that's concerned. It's like when people write to serial killers and want relationships with them in prison. It's the boundary you should just never breach. Or when you write to really violent criminals who are going to get out one day and you think you're going to get married to them and going to heal them, you're going a little bit too far down the road of believing that you are some kind of, I don't know, Christ-like figure who can save the world, and actually the likelihood is you're going to just introduce something terrible into your own home. We should all have a level of boundaries. And with a background like Brad has, if you happen to have a child, you should be running in the opposite direction as fast as possible. In fact, forget running, get one of those new electric scooters they have in places in the UK, bob on one of those, buzz off, get as far away as possible, because you know it's only going to go one way with this kind of heinous human being. Now, while she's in the relationship with Brad, Candice leaves her daughter Gabby at home with Cynthia while she goes out to see him. And of course, what we know about Cynthia is she's providing a loving, stable, warm environment where Gabby is going to be highly nurtured and also given good sense of boundaries, etc. She's a great person to take care of Gabby. Now, due to this, Cynthia was essentially Gabby's main caregiver. She was the one who'd feed her, put her to bed, love her. And actually, on reflection, Cynthia says one of the things that was very clear is that Candice showed a lack of care towards the fact that she was even just missing out on her own daughter's life, let alone providing her with the stability that you should wish to do so as a mother. And I suppose one can say, well, Candice did have a terrible upbringing from her own parents, so she hasn't necessarily learnt the understanding of how important foundation and security is. But then at 7, she did go and live with Cynthia, who's given her a pretty amazing life. So again, that blueprint, I feel, isn't fair to offer as an explanation, because that blueprint was shifted and changed when Cynthia arrived in her life. And she ends up deciding that as opposed to staying in a home with Cynthia where it's stable, it's warm, it's clean, she's going to go and live in Brad ex-con's caravan. That's right. Of all the places in all the world, where would you not wish to be than Brad's caravan? That in itself shows that she has a lack of clarity in thinking. She might want to be with Brad, but he's in a caravan. Why would you move out of a stable home to go live in a caravan? It's not going to be as safe, it's not going to be as sanitary, you're not going to have access to the same facilities, but at the end of the day, Candice doesn't care because Candice is thinking about herself. Now, of course, when she moves there, it means that Brad is now able to have power and domination over her because Cynthia isn't around and Cynthia is ex-military. You don't want to take her on. I'm sure that Brad would have had some, shall we say, serious consequences if Cynthia had seen him being violent to Candice around her. Now, bear in mind, this guy's got a track record of abuse, so of course it's going to play out in his relationship with Candice, and indeed it does. And even though neighbours said they could actually hear the violence playing out through these really thin caravan walls, no one reported anything. Because why would we? When a woman's getting beaten to within an inch of her life, Why would anybody think about, I don't know, calling 911, having a chat with an operator and saying there's a woman in danger? But no. And what does that say to somebody like Candice, who's already been neglected, who's already felt abandoned? Well, no one cares. There you go. You're the kind of person that I can leave in a home to burn to death whilst I protect my own needs. That messaging is very powerful, and it's one that's reinforced in her relationship with Brad. Now, apparently the reason that Candice stayed was because Brad was occasionally charismatic, occasionally protective, very persuasive, and very confident. So even though he beats her, and even though he's horrific to her, just occasionally, in that 5% of the time where he's not doing that, he can be, you know, a bit like a cult leader. So she basically has this reasoning within her psyche that she's really emotionally fragile, that she's desperate for approval from an authority figure, which he plays into. And she just latches on to this ludicrous, tiny amount of apparent strength and mistakes that power and control to some degree for stability, which again, I don't believe really plays out in reality. I just think that she makes a choice to care for a man more than a child. Now, neighbours, they actually record seeing Candice frequently with a lot of physical damage, black eyes, bruises, and people said that another thing was that her demeanour changed quite a lot. So she would very, very often seem withdrawn, her head was down, she'd avoid eye contact with people. And one of the reasons for that is because Brad had made it absolutely clear that she was completely banned from speaking to other men. And actually, this is to the extent where she'd have to leave a room if another male was present because she was scared of the consequences of the physical abuse. And what's really frustrating here is she could just have gone straight home to Cynthia and Cynthia would have looked after her. Now, bear in mind, at this point, Gabby is 3 years of age. She's got great care. Her grandmother's looking after her beautifully. Candice really can't be bothered seeing her. She does make very occasional visits, but there's just no real intention there of being a mother. She also would bring Gabby to the caravan on rare occasions too, but there's certainly not really a relationship there with Brad and Gabby. At this point, Candice becomes pregnant with another child. Now, Brad was not happy about this. Even though it's his biological child, he is not feeling that this is a good thing. And that's probably down to the fact that he feels that he didn't give her permission to go ahead and get pregnant. He's a control freak. So his life's going to change. There's going to be responsibilities. It's going to involve money. And of course, somebody as egocentric and selfish as Brad is not going to feel that that's a good thing for his life. And apparently, they really struggled in conflict around the fact that she was pregnant. Now, there was an argument that was witnessed by people. Some say it was because he was furious about her pregnancy. Others say that it was literally down to her parenting of Gabby, even though there wasn't really any parenting. But he felt apparently that she was too soft. You are too soft on your daughter. What daughter? You know, that one that you see very occasionally. The one I don't look after, that my grandmother looks after. Yes. You're too soft on the girl that you don't see and who somebody else looks after. And I'm really angry with you because of that. It just makes no sense whatsoever. Also, how dare he accuses her of choosing Gabby over him? And apparently these were not one-off arguments. They were frequent topics. They were constantly leading to these horrendous outbursts. And on one occasion, I kid you not, he's holding a .22 caliber pistol. And he kept that illegally. He wasn't going to have it. He was threatening to shoot Candice and said that he was going to shoot her and then shoot himself. So obviously very well adjusted. Also was calling her really worthless, saying that she was disloyal. He beat her up, repeatedly punched her in the head. Now, during that event, Candice obviously fears for her life. She's trying to use her phone to ask for help. And then he'd take the phone off her and then he smashed it over her. So at this point, Brad actually gets the gun, shoots the dog that they both own in the leg. That in itself should be a life sentence. Seriously, if you can take a gun to an animal that is loyal to you, then you can take a gun to anyone. It's as simple as that. But as I said, we know he's got psychopathic intent because he's already been accused of abusing animals in the past. Now that little dog had to crawl away bleeding out essentially. And then he actually says to Candice, after she's witnessed this, let's see if you can outrun these bullets. By the way, he was laughing at this point. Now, the next thing he actually did was shoot himself in the upper leg, just above the knee, on purpose. Now, fortunately for him, on an injury level, the bullet passed straight through the soft tissue, but missed the bone and major arteries. So he's bleeding out. Candice is screaming, but he's going to be okay. I always think it's really sad when we're talking about a case like this, where it could have just all ended if he just managed to hit a major artery in that moment. And I know that people think you should not wish somebody dead, but I have no problem doing it. I wish Brad had died in that moment. Now, this is where Candice takes the opportunity to run from him. She finds the phone, she calls the police. Brad, at this point, does the healthy thing and gives himself up to the police. Of course he didn't. Massive armed standoff. Police end up having to force entry. I mean, he's lucky they didn't shoot him, with respect. I mean, death by cop is something that happens in these situations, because if you're armed, you're dangerous. And if you don't know what they say, there's going to be some really serious consequences. Now, when the police enter the caravan, even though they're quite shocked at the situation playing out, because this guy has literally shot himself, they're also really stunned at the environment, because Candice is pregnant, so you'd expect some kind of sanitary environment just to protect her and the unborn child, but no. Stinks of rotting food. There is literally rubbish everywhere. There's an unsanitary toilet, and just put that into context, guys. We're talking about two adults living in this small space. If you have a toilet that isn't flushing or is overflowing or hasn't been kept clean, imagine the stench just of human waste before you add to it the rotting food, etc. The police said it genuinely looked like no one lifted a hand in there to clean up. They also found in that caravan evidence of drug use. They found guns, they found weapons hidden in floorboards, and at this point they're both arrested and taken in for questioning. Now, Candice says, look, the reason he's acted in this way is because of his schizoaffective disorder, and the police end up sending them home, and there's a pending investigation on them, but nobody's separated. They're allowed to return back. And I think that's a misstep, because this guy intentionally shot a dog, threatened a woman with a gun, and shot himself in the leg. Surely there should become some kind of mental health assessment at this point. Is there some kind of psychotic decline occurring? But just to send them home after questioning without any further action because there's a pending investigation just seems like a misstep on the authorities' part. Now, she returns to the police station just 3 days later. At this point, she tells the police that she wants to drop all the charges, and guess who's waiting in the car outside for her? Of course, it's Brad, because she knows that there are probably going to be some very serious consequences if she refuses to do his bidding. Now, bear in mind, she knows that Brad is not legally allowed to possess a firearm. So she ends up saying to the police, look, it's mine. It had nothing to do with him. So she takes the blame for that. And obviously we're talking about high-level manipulation and controlling behaviour here. She's just doing whatever he's telling her to do. And bear in mind, she's pregnant with his child at this moment in time. Just like Brad, I'm a little bit furious with her because no child deserves to be brought into the world with parents in such a state. But it seems like these individuals just don't get the memo on that, do they? Now, in December of 2016, she has the baby. She has a little girl. They name her Zoe. And Zoe has the very sad reality of being brought up in that grotesque environment I was describing before in the caravan. Now, at this point, Gabby is 4 years of age, still living with Cynthia, getting all her needs met. But bizarrely and unforgivably, legal events end up stripping Gabby of being able to live in the home with her gorgeously loving and caring grandmother, and instead she is forced into the caravan to live with Candice, Brad, and her new sibling Zoe. Now, the reason for this is because Cynthia wasn't the legal guardian of Gabby, so it meant that Candice was the person who needed to enroll her in school, and that's how she ends up living in this inhospitable, rotting, smelling environment. And I suppose that this basically begins the utter tragedy that I'm going to talk about. Because Brad, of course, doesn't like Gabby. Why doesn't he like Gabby? Because Gabby isn't his. So at the end of the day, he knows that another man has an imprint in his life, which is the fact that a child has been born to Candice, and that child is now present in his home, in his territory. He doesn't even refer to her as Gabby. He calls her that kid. Now, one look at a picture of Gabby. How could you not humanize this beautiful child? I cannot compute how a human being can look at a child and not see their innocence, their value, their worth, the mentorship that you can give to that child growing up, the gift of just being present in that child's life and experience, because you can have such a profound impact. And instead he sees her as a problem, a burden, baggage. Now, Candice, she's always had a really careless attitude towards Gabby because she's done very little with her. And so she's allowing this kind of horrific language, let alone action, to be levied at this 4-year-old child. And apparently he treated Zoe, his own child, completely differently. He won't have been a good father. We're just talking about a spectrum of shit. You know, he's shit, but then he can be extra shit, absolutely grotesquely shit, and then fatally shit. That's the kind of spectrum we're on. So Zoe's not having a great time. She's just acknowledged to be his and therefore be treated differently than Gabby. Now, bear in mind, they're living in this rundown mobile home, and I would say at this point there's a really clear dynamic that takes shape in their apparent family setup. He's the enforcer, then Candice is the silent accomplice, and Gabby, of course, is going to be the victim. Now, bear in mind, no matter how small your living abode is, and a lot of you out there will have small living abodes. I certainly, when I had my 2 young children, had a tiny home, literally a tiny home. And even though, you know, at the end of the day, when you've got kids, you want toys, you have to have a limit. Firstly, economically, toys are quite expensive, but you know, you can go to charity shops, as I did, and you can pick things up. But you've not got the room for a huge amount of child-centric objects. But you know, I would have my plastic tub with the toys in, and yes, when they were out, you would trip over and almost break your neck, but you wanted to make sure that in spite of the size of your home, you had an environment where a child felt that they were thought of and they were welcomed. But that's not how it is in this caravan. Yes, it's small, and I understand, like I said, that limits the amount of child-centric things you can have, but there was literally no child-sized furniture. There were no toys there. In fact, you wouldn't necessarily have known that a child who was 4 years of age lived in that caravan, except if you actually saw Gabby herself. She was regularly physically abused. She was beaten. She was slapped. I think one of the most dehumanizing things is that she was forced to sleep on a plastic trash bag on the floor. And when she was forced to sleep there, she would wear only underwear. And the reason for that is she would have a lot of accidents, and they didn't want her to have a clean bed because apparently she'd mess it up. Now, if you're a traumatized child who's been ripped from your safety, from your loving environment, from your warm, nurturing home, and you've been placed in a hellhole, and then you're forced to sleep on the floor, of course you're going to have a trauma reaction. And one of the clear trauma reactions that we see is regression when it comes down to bedwetting and soiling behaviours, because the child cannot control the functions because they're so terrified. And the very fact that this is being used against her so she can be further abused is just to highlight the absolute callousness of both the mother and stepfather in this case. She would also be made to just wear a bin bag for clothing because, again, they didn't want to clean up after her accidents. This is a 4-year-old little girl. They're making her wear a bin bag because they can't parent her in an integral way to her development. Now, bear in mind, she would be wearing that lack of clothing during freezing winter temperatures. And imagine how terrifyingly cold that is when you're in a caravan. She was denied food. Now, of course, that means that she ends up malnourished. She loses a lot of weight. She was punished constantly for that bedwetting behaviour. This was happening more and more that she was abused. So it's a cycle that just repeats itself and escalates. It's just that bodily reaction to the horrific stress she's enduring. They would then force her into taking cold showers and ice baths. This is a 4-year-old child we are talking about. Now, Brad is obviously the main perpetrator because he loves being sadistic. He's really enjoying this abuse. This is his fun. And Candice, as opposed to trying her best to stand in between Brad and her biological daughter, instead she just joins in. And we know this because there are evidence of texts sent from Brad literally telling Candice about the abuse it is causing to Gabby when she was out. And Candice would reply things like, beat her ass. So it would be encouraged, not discouraged. And one text said, she's pissed herself again. And Candice responded, give her a good beating for it. Can you believe how grotesque these humans are? Can you imagine texting that about a 4-year-old child? Give her a good beating for it. Brad told Candice that Gabby lied at times and that when she lied, she needs to, quote, learns what happens to liars. So again, this constant undertone of threat, this constant recognition that they have malice and malevolence towards this child and that she's going to deserve whatever she gets. Now, over the next 3 months, Gabby's daily reality, it just became one of constant fear and pain and torture. She's regularly being beaten. She's bruised all over her body. She's got bruises on her thighs, her arms. As I've said, she's not eating because you denied food when you're punished. She's also often just made to feel absolutely abandoned when she's forced to watch her primary caregivers eat while she's starving. She was also degraded as often as possible. They humiliated her. They made her sit in soiled clothing. They called her names like nasty or idiot. And there was actually another event where Brad would stab her with a fork. He would leave scratch marks on her with his nails. And again, massive failure of the neighbours. I cannot believe that any neighbour in that environment can just sit and allow a child to be horrifically abused within earshot and not do anything about it. They reportedly heard shouting from inside the trailer. They'll have heard crying of Gabby, but not one person intervened. Not one call was made. No welfare checks were conducted. And this could have saved Gabby. And it's shame on the society around Gabby who failed her in such a monumental way. And that might sound judgmental and that might sound to some people unfair. I don't care. I don't care. As a adjusted, typical human being, we care about the next generation. We care about their safety. We protect them when they're strangers, let alone children that are local to us. We do everything in our power to try to ensure their safety. To listen to a child screaming and crying, to hear people being violent towards that child and to not pick up a phone, even anonymously, it blows my mind. Now, according to court records, Brad spent a lot more time in the home with Gabby, so she's in his care most of the time. I don't know why Candice was less present in the caravan at this point, but she is. So this means, of course, that Brad has the perfect opportunity to unleash his sadistic desires, mostly by himself, because obviously Candice is out, and she sees evidence of this on a daily basis. He's texting her, letting her know what he's doing. She's coming back and she's seeing the bruises and the trauma. He also stated to Candice that he thought Gabby was wetting and soiling herself intentionally to annoy him. I kid you not. Can you imagine being somebody who is so desiring permission to harm a child that you create a scenario where the trauma that's leading to them soiling themselves and wetting themselves is a reason to actually attack them further because, you know, they're just doing it to upset you? Also, and this is just unreal, he claimed that she threw feces at him. With respect, I wish that were true. We know it won't be true, but my God, if anybody deserves shit being thrown at them, then Brad absolutely 100% deserves to have that directly in his face. Ideally, also covering a hammer, shall we say, because that would at least give some kind of comeback for the horror that he's inflicting on this little girl. And he sent a text message that said, "I'm going to drown her in my own urine before making her eat my feces." You see, again, I'm triggered, guys. I'm triggered. You know how I am in this. I cannot help but just go from the professional into the personal. And I feel that that text message should have been allowed to play out in his incarceration. So what's the punishment that you think is appropriate for a 4-year-old girl? I think drowning her in my own urine and forcing her to eat my feces. Right. Well, I mean, if it's okay for a 4-year-old child to endure and experience that, we're gonna see how you feel about it. Boys, you could just all line up. You make sure you've drank a lot and, yeah, ate some curry. Brilliant. It's gonna be a good day for Brad here. Honestly, it drives me insane. Now, officers would later observe a lock on the outside of Gabby's bedroom door as well, which meant that it was very likely she was confined at night, if not more than at night. And they also found dog feces in the living room. They found burn marks on the walls. This was a place of horror for this gorgeous little girl. Now, bear in mind, this child has gone from a loving home with Cynthia to this hellhole with Candice and Brad. And of course, Candice doesn't want Cynthia to have a lot of time with Gabby because she doesn't want her to see the injuries. In fact, the only time she saw her since moving away to the caravan was on Thanksgiving. And at this point, they did manage to hide all the evidence of abuse from her. But you can imagine that Cynthia would have had her concerns, and she probably is aware that it is not a great place for Gabby to actually be living and thriving. She should have been under her roof and her watch, because that was something that is tested, and we know it means that Gabby would be safe, and most importantly, it would mean that Gabby would be given all of the foundations that she needed to thrive. Now, during New Year's of 2017, Gabby's parents, and I'm using the word parents loosely here because I don't believe Candice is a mother, and I don't believe that Brad is a stepfather. I don't. I think these are predators. Look, you can give birth to a baby. That does not make you a mother. That makes you a biological creator. It's as simple as that. The thing that makes you a mother or a father is your actions. And some people just don't deserve to be called parents, and they don't. Because this apparent set of primary caregivers is going to do the absolute unthinkable. And guys, it is unthinkable. Gabby, this beautiful, innocent child, this child who's done nothing wrong, this child who's experiencing and enduring probably some of the worst trauma that any of us could envisage and imagine. They force her into a scalding hot bath. And I'm not talking about a mishap, a misstep, an accident. You know, most of us who have children will have ran a bath at some point, will have thought it's fine, will have put our child in, and they'll have pulled the toes up and kind of recoiled and made us realise that it's a little bit too hot for them. We're not talking about that. We also know that there are accidents where children have ran their own baths and it's been scalding hot water and terrible things have happened. It's very rare, but it does happen because people don't necessarily have temperature gauges on their hot water, and the consequence of that, it can come out almost boiling. But this is different. This is purposeful, willful, and intentional. They put her in this scalding hot bath. She's instantly screaming. She's instantly crying, and her skin is burning, literally burning, disintegrating. And they sit her in there all the while whilst her skin is burning. They're not splash-related burns. These burns were absolutely consistent with forced immersion. In fact, she suffered third-degree burns across her legs and buttocks, portions of her elbows, feet, and back. The skin on her left big toe detached entirely, and the investigators would later find her flesh melted into the bathtub's drain. We are talking, the water had been between 130 degrees to 140 degrees Fahrenheit, so 54 to 60 degrees Celsius, hot enough to cause irreversible tissue damage within seconds. Now, after she has gone through the agony, the degradation, the humiliation, the pain of being melted in that bathtub, they then got her, put her onto her bed, which is of course the bin bag on the floor, and they leave her. Overnight, that terrified child, who has been burnt beyond recognition with respect in areas of her body, she deteriorates very, very quickly. Now, Candice did actually admit later that she'd seen Gabby vomit multiple times, but you know what? She doesn't go and tend to her. She's not compassionate. She's not concerned. She just makes sure that in spite of the fact she's getting more and more dehydrated because of this, that they deny her food and water. Just the final indignity. Gabby, at one point, obviously in agony and so dehydrated, she was found trying to drink from the toilet. And medically, she was in a catastrophic state, so her body was in burn shock. That's a state that includes hypothermia, rapid dehydration, drop in blood pressure, and widespread cellular collapse. She's basically dying before their eyes. When she woke up, Candice and Brad showed anger towards her because she was obviously complaining of pain. And Candice decided that the way to handle this little girl's injured, broken, dying body was to run her another bath, to, quote, clean off her burns. Now, we know Candice was burnt very, very badly as a child. She went through multiple skin grafts. She knows the pain. She knows the agony of being burnt. And yet her answer to the pain of this child who has been burnt at her hands is to run another bath to clean off her burns. Firstly, that's not actually possible. Secondly, imagine the agony that you will feel when your already burnt skin is placed in boiling hot water. And that's exactly what they did. They repeated the exact same process as the night before, forcing Gabby into the scalding hot water, and then they scrubbed at her burn marks. Now, of course, this causes catastrophic damage to the skin. Gabby is screaming and crying in pain. Why are the neighbours not coming and doing anything? I can't even imagine how weak this child is at this point. This tiny little infant who's experienced this extensive, prolonged, protracted abuse and now is having her skin rubbed away by the mother who birthed her, the mother who's also going to be responsible with Brad for her death. And of course, Brad's loving it. He's encouraging the whole time. He's wanting more and more pain to be inflicted on this little girl. During that second bath, Candice actually had a hand over Gabby's mouth while she scrubbed away at her skin. And then, if that wasn't bad enough, she started to pull out Gabby's hair. Now, at this point, Gabby passed out. And apparently this is the first time that Candice became concerned of her own actions. At this point, just when she's pulled her hair out, ripped her skin off, burned her beyond belief, at this point, when Gabby can no longer deal with the pain, with the agony that her mother is inflicting on her and passes out, at this point, she's concerned for her safety. So she takes her out of the bath. She then throws her on the floor. And guess what? She's not breathing. She's succumbed to the horrific injuries that her mother has inflicted on her. And she calls, at this point, Cynthia to come round. Now, bear in mind, Cynthia has no idea this is playing out. Can you imagine the blindsiding, breathtaking horror that she walks into? She walks in to find Brad attempting CPR on Gabby. She witnesses the damage all over the girl's body, and she is just absolutely devastated. She can tell immediately that Gabby is very, very badly injured, if not already passing over. She notices that Gabby's breathing slow. Her pupils have dilated. She's soiled herself. It's a likely sign of neurogenic shock, or we know it also as the loss of autonomic control, because obviously she's losing the control of her bodily functions, and her body temperature was so low that her extremities were cold and stiff. Now, Cynthia immediately says, call 911. Around 10:45 a.m. she actually does that. And you know, when she's speaking to the emergency responders, when she has her dead daughter, albeit near dead daughter at this point, on the floor, does she sound upset? No. Her voice is flat, it's robotic, it's detached. She actually tells the dispatcher her daughter had been burned and was not waking up. She didn't say it was urgent. She didn't say that Gabby wasn't breathing. Now, paramedics obviously arrived very, very quickly. A burnt child is something they need to deal with immediately. And they walk in to horror. Gabby's naked. She's unconscious. She's lying on a urine-soaked towel on the bathroom floor. Her skin's literally blistered and falling away. She's not breathing. She's got no pulse. Her eyes are rolled back into the back of her head. The first responders again try CPR immediately. She's then transported to St. Joseph Mercy Hospital. They fought to resuscitate her, but she'd been starved of oxygen. She was experiencing septic shock. It was way too late. Gabby was pronounced dead shortly after arrival, and one nurse said in her entire career she'd never seen burns that extensive on a child. Others described the smell of burned flesh and the signs of prolonged neglect. So the impact just on sight of seeing this child so broken, so burned, so harmed was enough to stain their conscience. Hospital staff, of course, at this point notified the authorities immediately, and within hours, the Sumter Township Police Department began their investigation. When they questioned Candice at the scene, she tells investigators that Gabby had drawn herself a bath, stayed in it too long, and slipped and suffocated. She also said, Brad wasn't there. Oh, Brad isn't here. Brad wasn't there. No, Brad's had nothing to do with it. Just like he didn't have anything to do with the gun. Just like he's had nothing to do with any of the criminal things. No, he's completely innocent. And they were really disconcerted just by the way she presented, because she wasn't crying. She wasn't looking sympathetic. Her little girl's dead. No reaction whatsoever. Now, of course, the investigators don't even need the information to come from the perpetrator's mouths as far as what has happened, because they can see the darker truth behind what's played out. The remnants of Gabby's melted skin found in the bath and down the drain. The autopsy also confirms there was no water in her lungs, so she hadn't drowned. And they also noted that she'd suffered third-degree burns covering over 60% of her body, most of which had happened in the last 12 hours. The burns were in particular concentrated on her lower body, her legs, her buttocks, her back, her elbows. That suggested that she'd either been submerged in or sat in scalding hot water. The skin on her left foot and parts of her thighs had been sloughed off entirely. One of her toes was actually partially detached. She had extensive bruising across her body, her arms, her neck, her torso, her face, her buttocks. Many were already obviously older. They were already turning yellow and green from healing, but there were others that were fresh. So that shows there was this protracted length of abuse that she'd suffered and endured. They looked at the contents of her stomach. There was no solid food in there. They found internal bleeding in her abdomen. Her brain showed signs of blunt force trauma. So the autopsy actually led them to rule the official cause of death as child abuse homicide because of the complications of thermal injuries and blunt force trauma. So this was not an accident that she was trying to suggest as the mother. This was torture. In fact, that's what the medical examiner wrote. This was not an accident. This was torture. This child suffered. Now, of course, the thing about Brad Fields and Candice Diaz is they don't want to be guilty of this. They don't want to get caught. They don't want to get into trouble for it. They've carried out the most heinous torture and murder of a child, but they want to walk away from this. So essentially, they go on a run. So a day after Gabby's death, they become fugitives, essentially. Now, Candice was initially cooperative at the scene. She vanishes hours after the police interview her at the scene. She didn't return phone calls. And Gabby's half-sibling, 1-year-old Zoe, she's missing too. And obviously, they are not capable of looking after this child. Now, this is when the manhunt for the couple begin. The US Marshals, the FBI, the Georgia State Police, they're all alerted. And they're actually on the run for 8 days after they disappear. And they're found in a vehicle when they're arrested. Now, when it came down to Candice's interrogation, she continues to just claim that Gabby had run the water herself. She said the bath must have been too hot. It just must have been a little bit too hot. My child must have got in without realising. I thought she was just exaggerating. I didn't think it was that serious. I mean, can you believe that the lies can just trip off her tongue without any care, compassion or concern? They actually questioned her, understandably, on why she didn't call for emergency help straight away. And she said, I didn't think she needed it. She stopped crying after a while. What was that, when she was unconscious that she stopped crying? When she was literally passed out? They also then show her the text they found, the photos, the autopsy. At this point, she does start to say that Gabby had screamed in pain. She also admitted that Gabby had thrown up multiple times, and she also admitted that Gabby had been forced to sleep on the floor that night, unable to walk. But she refused to admit that she was responsible. She said, I didn't want her to die. I was scared. Brad gets really mad. Honestly, guys, I know it's not appropriate to stab anyone to death. I get that completely. But if a man was trying to do that to my child in front of me, well, you better hope that there'd be no sharp implements around or heavy implements around or a gun, which in America there probably would be, because he would not survive the episode. And that comes from a place of good intention, which is protective. You go near my child, you pay for the consequences. It's as simple as that. The idea that she could say, oh, I was complicit because he gets really angry, so I'll protect myself over my child. Isn't that interesting? That other grandparent who allowed her to almost burn to death, she has the same mindset as that person, full stop. She's quite happy for her child to be horrifically abused as long as she gets away with not necessarily getting harmed herself. I mean, it's disgraceful on every level. Now, when it comes down to Brad Fields' interrogation, well, of course, we know he's an arrogant idiot for a start, and it plays out that way. He's really volatile. He actually arrived at the station in shackles. He demanded to know if he was being recorded. He made comments about government conspiracies. Now, don't get me wrong, we know he's got schizoaffective disorder, so having psychotic breaks or having delusions about paranoia and suspicion, that is quite common, but that doesn't mean that he isn't just also, at this moment in time, objectionable questionable because he's an oppositional individual as a human being. Now, at one point he says, am I being set up? This is all bullshit. You guys are twisting this. I'm not really sure, Brad, that you can twist putting a child in boiling water whilst you applaud the mother for basically scraping this child's flesh off. And that's after months of you abusing this child, and we have all your text messages. But, you know, you crack on, sweetheart. But obviously, he's the victim, isn't he? He says, I wasn't even home. She's not even my kid. Ask the mum. Isn't it funny that he says, ask the mum? How dehumanising. Candice isn't an actual person. She's the mum. Now, when he was shown the text messages, Brad claimed, oh, okay, yeah, that is my phone. They are my messages. But you see, what you don't understand is my phone was hacked. It was hacked. Why did they hack your phone? I don't know, probably just to implicate me in some kind of massive conspiracy theory. But I wasn't even there. I don't even exist. I'm not even here. Honestly, I don't know how these interrogators do not feel that they should be given tasers just to use randomly during these kind of exchanges, because I would be driven to distraction. But yeah, apparently phone's been hacked. Then he said, no, actually, okay, they are my text messages, but you just don't get it. These are being taken out of context. So, you know, if you understood the true context, you'd be like, Brad's a great guy. He's done nothing wrong. Honestly, can you credit this kind of stupidity? And then he basically cracks and he says, you don't know what it's like to deal with a kid like that. She never listened, never shut up. Oh, okay. Okay. So if a child doesn't listen and, you know, chats away, your response is, what we should do is murder them. I mean, let's just be clear, guys. If this man is suggesting that a child who never shuts up and doesn't listen should be murdered, nurseries would be bloodbaths, because children aren't in the world to do those things until they grow up a little bit. That's why we call it the innocence and naivety of childhood. They don't have to abide by the ridiculous rules that society sets. They're just free beings. But yeah, he blames Gabby. He actually describes her as a little manipulator. Let that sink in. Genuinely, you know what I said earlier on about him believing that he could drown her in his own urine and force her to eat feces? I really do mean it, that this guy is deserving of that kind of treatment on a daily basis. Now, he also never actually asked the investigators if Gabby was dead. He never expressed any shock or grief. He just ranted on about how no one was listening to him, about how he was the victim, and about how everyone around him had failed him. In fact, he actually blamed it all on Candice as well. He said, I should have just left. I knew something was going to happen. I told Candice she wasn't cut out for this. Yeah, it's all Candice's fault. All the violence towards that child that he inflicted, that was all Candice's fault. Isn't it amazing how these kind of predators can minimise and just fail to take any accountability and responsibility for the horror that they've inflicted on these children? Now, when it came down to the charges and the court hearing, on January the 10th, 2018, this is just one day after the arrest in Georgia, Wayne County Prosecutor Kim Worthy announced a very long list of charges against both suspects. And the charges obviously reflect the brutality and the scope of Gabby's murder. So Candice Diaz and Brad Fields at this point were charged with felony murder, that's punishable by life without parole, second-degree murder, first-degree child abuse, torture, conspiracy to commit child abuse, failure to protect a child from harm. Fields also faced 2 additional charges, felon in possession of a firearm and parole absconder. Now, in March 2018, Candice and Brad appeared in a Wayne County court, and I love the judge. I literally want to write to this judge and ask this judge to teach all other judges how to act in these circumstances. Now, obviously, the evidence that was presented was graphic. There were the autopsy photos of Gabby's third-degree burns. There was the documentation of all the old and the new bruises. The medical examiner's testimony stating Gabby's death was a result of sustained torture. They also brought in over 1,000 text messages between Candice and Brad. There was also Candice's unemotional 911 call. And genuinely, there was just a sense of how could these individuals ever believe that anybody was going to think that they were anything other than guilty. Now, in late 2018, Candice's public defender advised her to take a plea deal, which makes sense because she is absolutely going down. And the state offered to drop the felony murder and torture charges in exchange for guilty pleas to second-degree murder, first-degree child abuse, and she actually accepted that. So she was sentenced at this point to 30 to 60 years in prison. That will make her eligible for parole in 2048. She'll be 55 at that point. Let's just hope that she never gets parole. And the judge said, Gabrielle was not lost to the world. You gave her away to pain. You did it silently. That silence is your legacy. Judge Evans, very powerful in everything they said. She's now serving her sentence at Huron Valley Correctional Facility. It's the only women's prison in the state. When it came down to Brad, well, you'll be pleased to know he was given life in prison without the possibility of parole. And the judge said, you systematically broke that child's body and spirit. You were a predator in every sense. Your punishment will be to wake up every day knowing exactly what you did. That was Judge Vonda Evans who said that to him. Brad Fields is currently incarcerated in a maximum security facility in Michigan, where he will spend the rest of his days, and amen for that. Because when it comes down to the horror they inflicted on that little girl, they deserve a life of torture. They really do. A lifetime. To have taken that child's life in the ways that they did, they literally deserve no peace. Now, when it came down to that beautiful little girl, Gabby, she was laid to rest during a small private service funded by donations from the community and also from her extended family. Her headstone says, our little light, forever loved. People from the community brought stuffed animals, pink roses, and hand-drawn pictures Gabby had made before moving out of her grandmother's home, that place of safety and serenity that was denied her, instead being shifted to that hellhole of a caravan with 2 torturers as the caregivers. A local preschool launched the Gabby's Garden Project. It's an annual spring planting event in which children grow flowers in her honour. It's all about teaching kids about compassion and community, the value of every child's voice, and also maybe teaching them that important lesson that when they grow up, raise the alarm when you see a child in danger. Gabby Barrett was described by those who knew her as a sweet, gentle, affectionate little girl. She's remembered as shy but loving, curious but eager to please, very affectionate with her grandmother who doted on her, bright, really expressive. And one of the family members said she was full of light, just a little sweetheart. She loved to be held, she loved to colour, she always wanted to help. And teachers and professionals who worked with her described her as a child with big eyes. Oh, they were beautiful big eyes, weren't they? I mean, the pictures I've put up just show you how beautiful that little girl was. They said that she was a child with big eyes that watched everything cautiously, as if waiting to understand whether she was safe. Imagine that. Imagine the people who were working with her seeing there was just something going on behind those big, beautiful eyes that was checking the environment to make sure that she didn't get on the wrong side of anybody, so the repercussions that she'd be used to at home didn't play out at school as well. They also said she was quiet, but she was present and she mattered. And I think that's the most powerful part, isn't it? She mattered. She mattered to everybody who came into contact with her, aside from the people who should have provided the best protection for her, Brad Fields and Candice Diaz. Like I said, I hope they suffer intolerably in prison. I really do. Child killers do not go down well, and for right reasons. And I feel so sorry for Cynthia. I cannot imagine her pain. She brought that child up well, and she would have continued to do so for the rest of her lives if she'd have been allowed to. Because of stupid rules and regulations, safety is often usurped by protocol. What a shame. What an absolute shame. Hard going, this one, guys. Can't even begin to imagine the feelings that child went through in her final moments. I know she's free now, and I know that she'll be surrounded in bliss, but she deserved a life fully loved and fully lived in this universe, not the next. Take care, guys. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Do you think they would have got off too easily in this case? I kind of do. I'm going to be honest with you. I think that 30 to 60 years is not something that she should have been given. I think she should have been in prison, life without parole. I don't care about her past. That does not give her an excuse for what she did in the future. Take care. Be safe.